All right, so you just finished opening presents, maybe had some eggnog, and you're thinking about taking down the decorations.
Yeah.
But over on Truth Social, former President Trump decided the day after Christmas was the perfect time to announce his wish list. Not the kind with socks and sweaters, though. More like Panama, Greenland, and Canada.
Oh.
Yeah, you heard that right.
It's fascinating to see him revisiting these places from his first term.
Right.
But this time there's an edge to his words, almost like he's learned from his past attempts.
That's what caught my eye, too. He doesn't just want these places. He's talking about national security, global freedom. It's a whole vibe.
Yeah.
We've got a stack of articles here, Fox News Salon, even the South China Morning Post, and they're all buzzing about what this could mean.
We're seeing a mix of reactions from folks cheering him on to those saying he's lost it.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to sort through all the noise and figure out what's actually going on. Because let's face it, Trump knows how to get people talking, but is he just stirring the pot, or is there a real strategy here?
Okay, let's start with Panama Canal. Trump's basically saying they're running the Panama Canal like their own personal piggy bank, jacking up fees and ripping off the U.S.
Right.
And then he throws in this whole thing about China secretly calling the shots, even having their soldiers there.
What's interesting here is that the U.S. used to run the Panama Canal for decades. It wasn't until 1999 that we handed it back to Panama.
Wow.
So when Trump talks about Panama ripping us off, it kind of taps into this feeling some people have about America losing its grip on power.
But Panama's firing back.
Oh, yeah.
They're denying any Chinese involvement and basically telling Trump to back off.
Absolutely. President Mulino of Panama was very clear they're a sovereign nation, and they're not going to let anyone dictate how they manage the canal.
Which makes sense when you think about how important that canal is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just some ditch in the jungle.
Nope.
Fox News said something like 5% of global trade goes through there, and almost 40% of U.S. container traffic relies on it.
Exactly. It's a vital artery for global commerce, and this is where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
Because one of the articles, Fox News again, I think mentioned a severe drought that's been messing with the canal's operations.
Oh, really?
Lower water levels mean they've had to limit traffic and raise fees.
Wait, so maybe those higher fees that Trump's complaining about aren't Panama trying to pull a fast one? Yeah. It could just be the drought, right?
It's certainly a factor. And it raises an important question. Are we seeing the early stages of climate change messing with global trade? Because if a drought can disrupt something as crucial as the Panama Canal, what happens when these extreme weather events become more frequent and severe?
That's a little scary to think about, and it makes you wonder if Trump's even aware of these bigger issues or if he's just focused on scoring political points.
Yeah. Well, let's not forget, he did just appoint Kevin Marino Cabrera as his ambassador to Panama, and Cabrera is a pretty hardcore America First guy, so maybe Trump's plan is to play tough and try to force Panama's hand. But whether that will work in a world where climate change is already changing the game is another question entirely.
Okay, so Panama's a powder keg? What about Greenland? Trump's still got his eye on that giant ice cube. Apparently this time he's saying it's all about national security and global freedom.
I can't help but think back to 2019 when he tried to buy Greenland. Remember that the whole world laughed at him?
Yeah.
And Greenland's Prime Minister Mute Jade has already said, and I quote, "Greenland is ours. We are not for sale and will never be for sale."
So not exactly rolling out the welcome mat for Trump. But why is he so obsessed with Greenland anyway? Is it really that important strategically?
It all comes down to location. Greenland sits smack dab in the middle of the Arctic, which is becoming a hotbed of activity as the ice melts and new shipping routes open up.
Oh, right, like the Northwest Passage?
Yeah.
That's been a big deal lately.
Exactly, and let's not forget the resources. Greenland has tons of those rare earth minerals that everyone needs for high-tech stuff, from smartphones to military equipment. So there's definitely an economic and strategic logic to wanting a presence there.
So it's not just about buying a giant chunk of ice. It's about controlling access to new shipping routes, resources, and maybe even a little bit about one-upping China and Russia in the Arctic.
Now you're catching on the Arctic is becoming a new frontier for military posturing as well. A U.S. base in Greenland would be a major power play.
Yeah.
But pulling it off is a whole other story. Greenland's made it clear they're not interested in being bought or bullied, and antagonizing them could push them closer to China or Russia, which would kind of defeat the purpose, wouldn't it?
Good point. All right, on to the last item on Trump's wish list, Canada. I still can't believe he suggested they should just become the 51st state. And he even called Governor Justin Trudeau in one of his posts, like, seriously.
It's hard to tell if he's being serious or just trying to get a rise out of people, but it definitely highlights this pattern of him poking fun at even antagonizing U.S. allies.
Yeah, it's not like they haven't had their differences in the past. Remember when Trump called Trudeau dishonest and weak?
Exactly. And all this raises a crucial question. If Trump wins a second term, what will that mean for U.S.-Canada relations? Will he continue to use this kind of aggressive, even bullying rhetoric? And how will Canada respond?
It's a bit unsettling, to be honest, especially considering how intertwined our economies and security are. I mean, they're our biggest trading partner and we share a massive border. Do we really want to be throwing insults across the fence like that?
It certainly doesn't seem like a recipe for a healthy relationship. And this brings us to another important theme that's emerging from all of this, the potential consequences of Trump's America First approach.
Because even if he doesn't literally annex Canada, which, let's be honest, is a pretty outlandish idea, his words and actions could still do a lot of damage, right?
Absolutely. It's not just about the specific policies he might pursue. It's about the message it sends to the world when the U.S., arguably the most powerful country on earth, starts acting like a bully. It undermines trust, creates instability, and opens the door for other countries to fill the void.
So we've got Panama pushing back, Greenland saying no thanks, and Canada probably wondering what they did to deserve this. What's the overall reaction been like in Latin America?
That's where El País comes in. Their analysis points out something really interesting. Latin American leaders have pretty much united behind Panama, rejecting Trump's claims and expressing concern about his intentions. They see this as a continuation of a long history of the U.S. treating Latin America as its own backyard. Which brings us to, well, I think we should unpack that in part 2 of our deep dive.
All right, cliffhanger. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be back soon to dig deeper into the historical context of U.S.-Latin American relations and explore whether this is just a Trump thing or a sign of a deeper shift in how the U.S. interacts with the world. Welcome back. Last we left off, we were unpacking Trump's post-Christmas pronouncements about Panama, Greenland, and Canada. And there was one detail about the Panama situation that I still can't get over, that whole thing about Chinese soldiers running the canal.
Yeah, it's a claim that definitely grabbed headlines, but as we saw, it's been strongly denied by Panama's government.
Right.
They've even invited people to come see for themselves that there are no Chinese soldiers operating the canal.
Okay, so maybe that was a bit of an exaggeration on Trump's part, but keeps bringing up China's influence in the region. Is that just political grandstanding, or is there something to it?
It's a question worth exploring. One of the articles from Huffington Post Italia talked about China's growing investments in alternative trade routes.
Okay.
They even mentioned this ambitious dry canal project in Honduras.
Hold on, dry canal, what's that all about?
Imagine a massive infrastructure project, highways, railroads, connecting the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans right through Central America. It's a bold move by China, and it could potentially reshape global trade flows.
Wow, that's a serious power play. No wonder Trump's feeling a little threatened, but let's be honest, the U.S. hasn't exactly been a perfect neighbor in Latin America, right? We've got some baggage down there.
That's an important point you bring up. El País had a really insightful analysis of the situation,
Okay.
arguing that Trump's rhetoric about Panama fits into a long-standing pattern of the U.S. treating Latin America as its own personal playground.
It's like we can just waltz in and do whatever we want.
That's been the perception, especially when you consider events like the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989 to overthrow Manuel Noriega.
Ouch. That's not exactly a confidence builder. So how does China fit into all of this? Are they just trying to make friends, or are they playing a longer game?
It's a complex situation, but it's clear that China sees an opportunity to expand its influence in a region that the U.S. has traditionally dominated. They're investing in infrastructure, building trade relationships, and offering an alternative to the U.S.-led world order.
Which makes you wonder, is this just about economics and trade routes, or is there also an ideological battle brewing, democracy versus authoritarianism, that kind of thing?
It's a question worth considering. Trump's America First philosophy often clashes with the values and interests of other democratic nations. His praise for leaders like Putin and Kim Jong-un has raised concerns about his commitment to democracy and human rights, and his attacks on international institutions like NATO and the World Trade Organization further fuel anxieties about his foreign policy approach.
It's like he sees the world as a giant game of winners and losers where everyone's out to get us.
And that kind of thinking can be dangerous, especially in a world that's increasingly interconnected. Globalization has created a web of interdependencies that makes it difficult to simply go it alone. But Trump seems to believe that the U.S. can regain its strength by prioritizing its own interests above all else, even if it means alienating allies and disrupting global norms.
So is he right? Can the U.S. really afford to go it alone in a world where China's rising and other powers are challenging the status quo?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that experts are debating right now. Some argue that the U.S. needs to take a more assertive stance to protect its interests, even if it means being more confrontational with China. And others say that the best way to maintain U.S. leadership is through cooperation, diplomacy, and building strong alliances.
It sounds like there's no easy answer. But all this talk about China's rise and shifting global power dynamics makes me a little nervous. Could we be heading towards another Cold War this time with China as the main adversary?
That's a possibility. That some experts are worried about the tensions between the U.S. and China are certainly escalating, and there's a risk that things could spiral out of control, especially if there's a miscalculation or a lack of communication.
So what can be done to prevent things from getting worse? Is there any hope for a more cooperative and peaceful future?
Well, a lot depends on the choices that leaders make in the coming years. If the U.S. and China can find ways to manage their differences, cooperate on shared challenges like climate change and global health, and build trust through dialogue, then maybe we can avoid a new Cold War.
But what if Trump wins a second term and continues down this path of confrontation and isolation?
That's a scenario that many people are worried about. Trump's America First agenda has already strained relationships with key allies, and his unpredictability makes it difficult to know what to expect if he wins a second term. It could signal a more permanent shift towards a more divided and unstable world.
It all sounds pretty bleak, to be honest. But is there anything that everyday people like us can do to make a difference? It feels like these big geopolitical forces are way beyond our control.
That's where informed citizenship comes in. By staying engaged, educating ourselves about these complex issues, and holding our leaders accountable, we can all play a role in shaping a better future. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these challenges, but remember, change often starts at the grassroots level.
So we shouldn't just throw up our hands and say it's all hopeless.
Absolutely. Not every voice matters, and every action, no matter how small, can contribute to positive change. By engaging in thoughtful dialogue, building bridges across divides, and advocating for policies that promote peace and cooperation, we can help create a more just and sustainable world.
Okay, I like that. A more just and sustainable world. That's something worth fighting for. But before we get too carried away with saving the world, we still have one more stop on our Trumpian world tour to cover. We've talked about Panama and Greenland, but what about those jabs he took at Canada?
That's where we'll pick up in part 3, because those comments, while they might seem like just another Trumpian outburst, actually reveal some deeper tensions in the U.S.-Canada relationship tensions that could have real consequences for both countries. So stay tuned. We'll be right back to explore that in more detail.
All right, so we've journeyed from the Panama Canal to the icy plains of Greenland, and now we're circling back to our neighbors to the north. It's easy to brush off Trump's comments about Canada as just more of his, well, Trumpisms, but maybe there's more to it than just a few jabs at Trudeau.
I think you're right to be cautious about dismissing it as just Trump being Trump. Remember, Canada isn't just some random country. They're our biggest trading partner. Our economies are deeply intertwined, and we share a massive border, not exactly the kind of relationship you want to mess with.
That's true, and it's not like things have always been smooth sailing between them and Trump. There were those trade disputes, those personal insults.
Exactly, and this latest round of comments suggesting Canada become the 51st state calling Trudeau governor, it all points to a deeper tension that goes beyond personal animosity. It speaks to Trump's America First worldview and how that might play out with even our closest allies.
Because if he's willing to throw shade at Canada, a country we've historically had a pretty good relationship with, what does that say about how he might approach other countries?
It's a valid concern because the America First approach at its core is about prioritizing U.S. interests above all else, and that can create friction even with allies who share similar values and goals.
So even if Trump doesn't actually try to annex Canada, which, let's be honest, is a pretty outlandish idea, his rhetoric could still damage the relationship and make it harder to cooperate on things like trade, security, even environmental issues.
Exactly, and that brings us back to a key takeaway from this whole deep dive. Words have consequences. Trump's pronouncements, even if they're not backed by concrete actions, can still shape perceptions, influence policy decisions, and potentially lead to unintended consequences.
It's like that butterfly effect thing. One seemingly small action can set off a chain of events with far-reaching impacts.
Precisely. And in the realm of geopolitics, where power dynamics are constantly in flux and the stakes are incredibly high, those impacts can be felt around the world.
So where does that leave us? We've covered a lot of ground today, from the Panama Canal to Greenland to Canada, and we've touched on some pretty big themes, but what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What do we want them to walk away with?
I think the most important thing is the importance of critical thinking. We've seen how easily information can be manipulated, how claims can be taken out of context, and how important it is to consider multiple perspectives.
Especially when it comes to something as complex as geopolitics. There are so many competing narratives and agendas at play.
Exactly. So don't just accept everything you read or hear at face value. Dig deeper. Ask questions and challenge your own assumptions.
Be skeptical, but also be curious.
I like that, skeptical but curious. That's a great mindset for navigating today's world. Another key takeaway is the importance of historical context. We can't understand what's happening today without understanding the past.
Like those historical tensions between the U.S. and Latin America that we talked about, that history continues to shape those relationships today, and it helps explain why countries like Panama are so sensitive to Trump's rhetoric.
Exactly. And finally, I think it's crucial to remember that we live in an interconnected world. What happens in one part of the world inevitably affects other parts.
Like that dry canal project in Honduras that we talked about, that has the potential to shift global trade patterns and reshape power dynamics in the region.
Exactly. So we can't afford to be isolationist or to think that we can simply ignore what's happening in other parts of the world. Our fates are intertwined, and we need to find ways to cooperate and build a more just and sustainable future for everyone.
Well said. It's been a wild ride today unpacking all of this, but I think we've managed to shed some light on some pretty complex issues.
I hope so, and I hope our listeners will continue to explore these topics, to engage in thoughtful discussions, and to use their voices to advocate for positive change.
Because as we've learned today, even seemingly small actions can have a ripple effect. So let's all go out there and make some waves. And until next time, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.